At exactly 4:50 on a Sunday afternoon in September, I was standing in my own driveway watching my daughter hold my car keys up like she'd just confiscated them from a teenager. "You won't need this anymore, Dad," Denise said. She said it lightly, almost cheerfully, the way you'd announce you'd taken care of a chore so someone else wouldn't have to worry about it. Behind her, my two grandkids sat buckled in the back of her minivan, watching through the window with the particular blankness kids get when they sense something's wrong but haven't been told what. Her husband, Craig, stood a few feet back near the mailbox, not quite meeting my eyes, which told me everything about how long this had been planned before I ever walked outside. "That's my car," I said. "I know, and it's going to stay right here, safe in the driveway, until we figure out a better arrangement." She dropped the keys into her purse like it was already settled. "You scraped the Hendersons' fence yesterday, Dad. You could have hit their dog. You could have hit a kid. I clipped a fence post backing out of a parking spot that was 6 inches too narrow for a Buick, and I stopped the second I felt it. Nobody was hurt." Nothing was hurt except the fence, and I already called Ray Henderson and told him I'd pay for it. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Denise?" She looked at me the way you look at someone you've already decided not to argue with, because arguing would mean treating their opinion as something worth considering. "The point is you're 74. The point is Mom's been gone 3 years and nobody's been keeping an eye on how you're really doing out here by yourself. The point is I found out about the fence from Mrs. Henderson, not from you, which means you weren't even planning on telling me." "I wasn't planning on making a phone call about a mailbox." "It wasn't the mailbox, it was a fence post, and that's not the point either." She was already walking backward toward the van now, keys zipped safely into the front pocket of her purse. "We'll talk about it this week. I'll come by Wednesday and we can look at some options together." "Options for what?" "For getting you set up with rides. For maybe looking at some communities that have transportation built in, so you're not so isolated out here." She said the word isolated the way people say words they've picked up from a pamphlet, careful and clinical, like it belonged to someone else's vocabulary before it became hers. "I love you, Dad. I'm doing this because I love you." Then she got in the van, buckled herself in, and drove away with my car keys in her purse, leaving me standing in my own driveway next to a car I'd owned outright for 11 years, in a silence so complete I could hear the sprinklers running 2 houses down. I want to explain something about me before I go any further into this, because I think it matters to understand exactly how it felt to watch my daughter walk off with my car keys like she was confiscating a set of scissors from a child. My name is Walter Hensley. I spent 41 years as an automotive mechanic, 11 of them running my own shop on Route 9 before I sold it, and worked out my last decade as a technician at a dealership in town. I have rebuilt more transmissions than I could count if you gave me a week to try. I taught both my children to drive, on this same street, in a Ford my late wife Margaret used to call the tank, because of how solid it felt under you. I have driven through blizzards, through floods, through the worst ice storm this county saw in 30 years, delivering emergency parts to stranded drivers on roads the county plows hadn't reached yet. Because that was the kind of mechanic I was, the kind who showed up. I have never had a moving violation in 58 years behind the wheel, not one. And on a Sunday afternoon in September, my 44-year-old daughter took my car keys out of my hand. Well, out of the little dish by the front door where I always kept them, but it amounted to the same thing, because I'd clipped a fence post at 4 miles an hour backing out of a parking spot. Margaret passed 3 years ago this past spring. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone in under a year from the day we found out. I won't pretend the house hasn't felt different since then, quieter in a way that has nothing to do with sound. But I want to be clear about something, because it matters to everything that comes after. Quiet isn't the same thing as incapable. I still mowed my own lawn. I still cooked my own meals, mostly decent ones, thanks to 40 years of Margaret teaching me more than I ever admitted to learning. I still drove myself to the grocery store, to the hardware store, to Tuesday morning coffee with the same 3 retired guys I'd been having Tuesday morning coffee with since Nixon was in office. My car wasn't a convenience. It was the last unbroken thread connecting me to a life I'd built for myself, one that didn't require anyone's permission to keep living. I hadn't seen the fence post thing coming as a turning point, because at the time, it hadn't felt like one. It felt like a fence post. Looking back now, though, I can see it wasn't really about the fence at all. It was the excuse Denise had been waiting for. She'd started laying groundwork almost a year earlier, so gradually I hadn't recognized it as groundwork at the time. It began with small check-ins that felt like ordinary daughterly concern. A phone call asking if I'd been eating enough. A comment about how big the house felt for one person. A mention, almost offhand, that her friend's father had moved into one of those independent living places and loved it. How nice it was not having to worry about yard work anymore. I hadn't thought much of any single conversation. It was the accumulation I missed, the way each comment built quietly on the one before it, until, "Have you thought about downsizing?" had somehow become a question I was expected to already be considering seriously. Then, 4 months before the fence post, I'd had one bad week. I'd misplaced my reading glasses 3 days running, forgotten a dentist appointment I'd had circled on the calendar for a month, and once, this is the one Denise brought up most, I'd walked out of the grocery store and spent almost 10 minutes searching 3 rows of the parking lot before I found my own car, because I'd been distracted thinking about a plumbing problem in the upstairs bathroom and genuinely lost track of where I'd parked. I told Denise about it myself at Sunday dinner, as an embarrassed little joke about getting older. I remember her going very quiet at the table, the way people go quiet when they're filing something away rather than actually listening to you. 2 weeks later, she suggested, gently, that I get checked out, just to be safe. I agreed, mostly to put her mind at ease, and saw my regular doctor, who ran through a standard cognitive screening in about 15 minutes, and told me plainly that I was sharp as a tack for a man my age, that misplacing glasses and losing your car in a parking lot while thinking about plumbing was called being a human being, not a diagnosis. I brought the results home and told Denise. She said that was great news. She said it in a tone that didn't quite match the words. I didn't think anything more of it until the day she took my keys, when I realized, standing in my empty driveway, that the doctor's clean bill of health hadn't changed her plans even slightly. It had only changed her approach. That evening I called my son Peter, who lives 4 hours away in Columbus and has always been the quieter of my 2 kids, less prone to taking charge of a room, which had made him, over the years, easier to overlook when it came to family decisions, but also, I was starting to realize, possibly more honest with me than his sister had been in a long while. She took the keys right off my porch dish, I told him. Didn't ask. Just told me I wouldn't need them and put them in her purse and drove off. Peter was quiet for a moment. Dad, I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to think I've been keeping it from you on purpose. I just didn't think it was my place to bring it up first. Bring what up? Denise called me last month, asked if I'd support getting a power of attorney set up for you. Financial and medical both. She said it was just to be prepared, in case anything happened suddenly. I told her I didn't think it was necessary, that you seemed fine to me. She got kind of short with me, and said I didn't see you as often as she did, that I didn't understand how things had really been. I sat down slowly in Margaret's old kitchen chair, the one I still hadn't been able to make myself get rid of. Power of attorney. Over what exactly? She didn't get real specific. She mentioned the house a couple times, though. Asked me if I thought you'd ever consider selling, now that it was more house than one person needs. Peter's voice had an edge to it I rarely heard from him. Dad, I don't want to jump to conclusions here, but taking your keys over a scraped fence post, right after asking me about power of attorney, right after asking about the house, that's not one thing. That's a pattern, and I think you should pay attention to it before it goes any further. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after we hung up, looking at the little dish by the front door where my keys had sat, undisturbed, for 11 years, now empty for the first time since I'd bought that car. I thought about the shop I'd run for 11 years, about every engine I'd ever rebuilt from a pile of parts that looked like nothing to anyone but me. I thought about 58 years without a single moving violation. I thought about a doctor telling me, in plain language, that there was nothing wrong with my mind. And I thought about the fact that somewhere in my own daughter's purse, sitting next to her wallet and her grocery list, was a set of keys that had nothing to do with a fence post at all. I didn't sleep much that night, and I didn't call Denise back either, though I could see on my phone that she'd texted around 9 asking if I was doing okay after our talk, as if she'd delivered a diagnosis instead of taking my car keys. By morning, I'd decided something important. I wasn't going to fight this with anger, because anger was exactly what would let Denise stand in front of anyone, Peter, a lawyer, a judge, God himself, and say, "See, this is what I mean, he can't handle being told no." I'd spent 41 years working with men who lost their temper the second an engine didn't behave the way they expected, and I'd learned early that the ones who stayed calm were always the ones who actually found out what was really broken. So Tuesday morning, same as every Tuesday morning for going on 19 years, I walked the 8 blocks to Ferrante's diner for coffee with Gus Pruitt and Sal Del Vecchio, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I actually needed the company more than I wanted the coffee. Gus retired from the post office after 30 years and still knew more about this town's business than anyone with a badge. Sal ran a contracting company for 3 decades before handing it to his nephew, and he still kept half the tradesmen in the county on speed dial out of habit. I told them everything: the fence post, the keys, the doctor's clean bill of health, Peter's phone call about power of attorney, and the house. Sal sets his coffee down slower than a man needs to set a coffee down. "Walt, I don't want to say something I can't back up. But you know my nephew does closings over at First County Title, right? Might be worth a call. Not to snoop, just to know what you're dealing with. I'm not going to go digging through my own daughter's business like she's a suspect." "You're not digging through her business," Gus said. "You're finding out if somebody's been digging through yours." He wiped his glasses on his shirt, the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd already thought through carefully. "Walt, you and I have been having this coffee since before Denise had her first kid. I like her. I always have. But to be prepared, that's not how a daughter who's just worried about her father talks. That's how somebody talks when they've already made a decision and they're looking for people to agree with it." I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have made either of them wrong. I went to the bank that same afternoon, on foot, the walk taking me nearly 40 minutes each way, which I told myself was good for my knees and tried not to think about as the first small cost of not having a car. I'd banked at Heritage Trust for 36 years, since before it was even called Heritage Trust, and the branch manager, a woman named Carol Deal, had known me since she was a teller in her 20s. I wasn't there to make a scene. I told her honestly that I wanted to review my accounts, make sure everything was in order, and ask a few questions about how power of attorney worked, since my daughter had mentioned setting one up. Carol pulled up my accounts, walked me through the balances, everything exactly where it should be. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said something that stopped me cold. "Actually, Mr. Hensley, your daughter was about 3 weeks ago asking some similar questions. Wanted to know what it would take to get added as a joint account holder or set up power of attorney access." I told her, same as I'm telling you, that we'd need you present and sign off on any of that yourself. Bank policy. We can't set anything like that up without the account holder physically here. 3 weeks ago, I said, before the fence post. Carol looked at me a little strangely. "I don't know anything about a fence post, Mr. Hensley." I just remember she seemed a little frustrated when I told her it couldn't be done without you. I thanked her, walked the 40 minutes home, and sat on my porch for a long while turning that piece of information over. 3 weeks before I ever clipped that fence post, my daughter had already been trying to get access to my accounts. The keys hadn't started anything. The keys were just the next available excuse once the first attempt hadn't worked. Sal's nephew, a young man named Tommy who I'd known since he was in diapers, called me back 2 days later, sounding a little uncomfortable about the whole thing, which told me he understood exactly what he was telling me before he even said it. "Mr. Hensley, I want to be careful here, because this isn't really information I should be handing out, but you asked, and Uncle Sal vouched for you, and honestly, I think you deserve to know." A pause. "Your daughter and her husband came into our office about 6 weeks ago, asking questions about a reverse mortgage. In your house, they said they were exploring options on behalf of an aging parent. A reverse mortgage requires the homeowner's signature," I said. "I might be a mechanic by trade, but I'd been alive 74 years and paid off a house in full. I knew what a reverse mortgage was." "Right. And when our agent explained that you'd need to be present, competent, and willing, your son-in-law asked a follow-up question I still remember pretty clearly. He asked what would happen if the homeowner's competency became a documented concern down the road." Tommy's voice had gone quiet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hensley. I don't like being the one to tell you that. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after we hung up, looking out at my empty driveway, at a car with no keys in it, parked exactly where Denise had left it. 6 weeks before the fence post, my son-in-law had asked a mortgage broker what would happen if my competency became a documented concern. That wasn't a man worried about his father-in-law's driving. That was a man laying groundwork. I found out about Craig's business trouble almost by accident, the way you find out about most things in a town this size. Not because anyone told me directly, but because everyone was already talking about it and I'd simply never been listening for my own name attached to it before. Gus mentioned it the following Tuesday, carefully, the way you bring up something you've been sitting on. Craig ran a landscaping and hardscaping outfit, decent-sized, maybe a dozen guys on payroll during the busy season. According to Gus, who'd heard it from a supplier who delivered mulch to half the contractors in the county, Craig had overextended badly on equipment financing 2 years back, right before a slow season nobody saw coming, and was now facing a supplier lawsuit over an unpaid balance north of $80,000. Word was he'd already maxed out one line of credit trying to keep the crews paid through the winter. "That's not proof of anything, Walt," Gus said, holding up a hand before I could say what we were both already thinking. "Plenty of guys run into trouble in that business, and it's got nothing to do with their in-laws." "No," I agreed, "but there's a reason, and I didn't have a reason before this morning. I thought about my house, paid off free and clear in 2009, appraised 2 years ago, when I'd looked into refinancing something small, at just under $400,000. I thought about a reverse mortgage broker being asked, what happens if competency becomes a documented concern? I thought about Denise sitting across from Carol Deal at Heritage Trust 3 weeks before a fence post gave her a story she could tell people. A story that made taking my car keys sound like love, instead of the first move in something much bigger. I didn't have proof of intent. I want to be honest about that, the same way I'd want anyone telling this story to be honest about it. I didn't have a signed confession, and I wasn't going to pretend a supplier's mulch order and a broker's uncomfortable memory added up to a courtroom case. What I had was a pattern, the same kind of pattern Peter had warned me about on the phone, each piece small enough to explain away on its own and impossible to explain away once you lined them up in order. That evening, I called the dealership where I'd worked my last decade before retiring, spoke to the parts manager I used to work beside, and asked him quietly whether they could cut me a spare key for my own car, using the VIN on file from my last service visit. He didn't ask why. Men who spend their careers around cars generally understand, without needing it spelled out, that a man's relationship to his own vehicle isn't really about the vehicle. He had a spare cut and mailed it to me within the week. I didn't use it right away. I wasn't ready yet to drive off in my own car like a man sneaking out of his own life. What I was ready to do, holding that small brass key in my palm on my porch that evening, was start building something Denise couldn't take from me the way she'd taken the one off the dish by my front door. A record, dates, names, what Carol had told me, what Tommy had told me, what Gus had heard from a mulch supplier who had no reason in the world to lie about any of it. If my daughter was going to build a case that I couldn't be trusted to run my own life, I intended to make sure that whoever eventually heard both sides of this story would have more than her word to go on. I just didn't yet know it would take a lawyer, a locksmith's records, and my own granddaughter to finally get her to listen. Peter drove down the following weekend, 4 hours each way, without me having to ask twice. We sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad between us and wrote out everything in order. The fence post, the doctor's clean screening, Carol Deal and the joint account inquiry, Tommy's story about the reverse mortgage broker, Craig's supplier trouble, all of it, dated as best we could remember. "This isn't enough to prove intent in a courtroom," Peter said, tapping the pad, "but it's enough that somebody with the right kind of law degree ought to look at it before Denise gets any further ahead of us." He found Patricia Nolan through a coworker whose own mother had gone through something similar 2 years earlier, an elder law attorney with an office above the hardware store downtown, the kind of practice that mostly handled wills, guardianships, and the occasional family that had stopped being able to talk to each other without a lawyer in the room to keep things honest. I brought the legal pad. Peter came with me. Patricia read through it twice before she said anything, the same careful, unhurried way Vanessa Cruz had once read through a box of letters for a friend of mine. though I didn't know that story yet at the time, only that I recognized the particular stillness of a professional deciding how seriously to take something. "I want to explain how guardianship actually works in this state," she said finally, "because I think that's the piece you're missing, and it's the piece that should worry you most." "I'm listening." To have someone declared incapacitated and placed under guardianship, a petitioner, say your daughter, has to file with the probate court, and the court will order an independent evaluation, usually a physician or psychologist, sometimes both. If that evaluation finds you lack capacity to manage your own affairs, the court can appoint a guardian, who then gets legal authority over your finances, your medical decisions, potentially where you live. She folded her hands. Here's the part people don't expect. The petitioner gets to describe the concerning behavior that triggers the evaluation in the first place. A fence post, a misplaced set of glasses, a story about getting turned around in a parking lot. None of it needs to be true in the way you and I mean true. It just needs to sound plausible enough on paper to convince a judge an evaluation is warranted. And once the evaluation's ordered, then it comes down to whoever's doing the evaluating. Which is exactly why I'd rather you not wait for Denise to pick the doctor. Patricia slid a legal pad of her own across the table. "I want you to do two things, Mr. Hensley, and I want you to do them this month, not whenever you feel comfortable. First, get an independent cognitive evaluation and a driving assessment from providers of your own choosing, on record, before anyone files anything. If your daughter ever does bring a petition, I want the court looking at results you got first, on your own initiative, not results she arranged after the fact. And the second thing, execute a durable power of attorney, financial and medical, naming someone you trust. Today, if you can manage it. Not because you need one right now, you clearly don't, but because an unclaimed power of attorney is an invitation, Mr. Hensley. The moment you have one in place, naming someone who isn't your daughter, a guardianship petition against you becomes a much harder case for anyone to make. Courts generally prefer a family's own arrangement to a court-imposed one, provided the person making it is demonstrably competent to do so. I looked at Peter. He didn't say anything, just held my gaze, steady, the way his mother used to when she wanted me to know she'd follow me into a decision without needing to be asked twice. "Peter," I said. "I'm here," he said, "whatever you need." We signed the paperwork in Patricia's office that same afternoon, witnessed and notarized on the spot. I named Peter as my durable power of attorney for both finances and medical decisions, effective immediately, not contingent on some future incapacity that hadn't happened and wasn't coming. It felt strange, signing a document about my own decline while feeling more clear-headed than I had in months, but Patricia was right about one thing I understood instantly and completely. This wasn't about proving I'd never need help someday. It was about making sure that whenever that day came, if it came, the person deciding what help meant would be someone who'd actually asked me first. The cognitive evaluation happened 2 weeks later, at a clinic in the city, with a neuropsychologist named Dr. Amara Bassi, who spent nearly 3 hours running me through tests I'd never heard of, and a few I found almost insulting in their simplicity, though I understood by the end why every level of difficulty mattered. She called 2 days later with the results. "Mr. Hensley, I want to be direct with you, because I understand there's a reason you sought this out proactively, and you deserve a direct answer. Your cognitive function is entirely within the normal range for your age. Across every domain we tested, memory, executive function, processing speed, all of it. There's no evidence of dementia, no evidence of mild cognitive impairment, nothing that would raise any concern about your capacity to manage your own affairs. Would you put that in writing? I already have. It's in the report I'm mailing you today." The driving assessment came a week after that, through a certified occupational therapist who specialized in evaluating older drivers, a woman recommended by Patricia, specifically because her assessments held up well in court when they needed to. She rode with me for 40 minutes through city traffic, highway merges, a parallel parking test I hadn't attempted since my own road test decades earlier, and a reverse and back-out maneuver that felt, I'll admit, pointedly similar to the exact situation that had started all of this. "Mr. Hensley," she said, clipboard in her lap as we pulled back into the clinic lot. "In 22 years doing this job, I don't give a perfect score often. You just got one. I had, in the span of 3 weeks, assembled a durable power of attorney naming my son, a clean neuropsychological evaluation, and a certified driving assessment scoring me a perfect result. 3 separate professionals, none of them related to me, none of them with a single reason to lie on my behalf, all confirming the same thing a fence post had apparently convinced my daughter she already knew better than any of them. I still didn't have my car keys back. I hadn't told Denise about any of it yet, on Patricia's specific advice. "Let her show her hand first," Patricia said during our follow-up call. "If she's serious enough about this to have already approached a bank and a mortgage broker, I'd rather know the full scope of what she's planning before we respond to it. Right now, you're building a record. The moment you confront her with it, that record stops growing." I didn't have to wait long to find out how right she was. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a process server who knocked on my door with the particular flat courtesy of a man who does this for a living and has stopped feeling anything about it either way. I signed for it standing on my own porch, in the same spot where Denise had once told me I wouldn't need my car keys anymore, and opened the envelope with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be. It was a petition, filed in probate court, requesting the appointment of a guardian over my person and estate, on the grounds of declining cognitive capacity, evidenced by a pattern of concerning behavior, including but not limited to a motor vehicle incident, episodes of disorientation, and general inability to safely manage independent living. The petitioner listed was Denise Marsh. The proposed guardian, should the court find in favor of the petition, was also Denise Marsh. I called Patricia within the hour. She listened to me read the whole thing over the phone, quiet and unhurried, the way she'd been quiet and unhurried over every piece of this from the beginning. "Good," she said when I finished. "Good? Mr. Hensley, she just put everything she's been building toward, on paper, under penalty of perjury, in a filing that names herself as the sole beneficiary of her own accusation." I heard the faint sound of her pulling a folder from a drawer. "She's forced this into a courtroom, with a judge and rules of evidence, at exactly the moment you happen to be holding a perfect driving score, a clean neuropsychological evaluation, a durable power of attorney naming someone else entirely, and a paper trail showing she was inquiring about access to your accounts 3 weeks before the incident she's citing as the reason she needed to." A pause. "I've been doing this a long time. I don't often get handed a case this cleanly built by the other side. There's a hearing date? 3 weeks from Tuesday. I want you there early. I want Peter there. And Mr. Hensley, I want you to bring the car. I drove myself to the courthouse. I want to say that plainly, because it mattered more to me than almost anything else that happened that day. I used the spare key the dealership had cut for me weeks earlier, backed out of my own driveway without incident, and parked 2 blocks from the county courthouse at 8:40 in the morning for a hearing scheduled at 10, because Patricia had told me to arrive early, and I'd never once in my life been late to something that mattered. Peter met me on the courthouse steps. Denise arrived 20 minutes later with her own attorney, a younger man I didn't recognize, and Craig trailing a few steps behind her, his eyes fixed somewhere around his own shoes. She saw me standing there, upright, alone, having clearly driven myself, and something crossed her face I hadn't expected to see. Not anger. Something closer to the beginning of doubt. The hearing room wasn't what I'd pictured from television. Just a modest space with a judge's bench, 2 tables, and a scattering of chairs along the back wall where Gus and Sal had quietly seated themselves 20 minutes before it started, uninvited and unmovable, because that's the kind of friends they'd turned out to be. Judge Eleanor Whitfield, no relation, a coincidence I noted with a private, aching kind of comfort given my mother-in-law had shared the name, read through the petition, then through Patricia's response, before she even asked either side to speak. "Ms. Marsh," she said finally, "your petition describes a pattern of concerning behavior, including a motor vehicle incident and, I quote, episodes of disorientation. Can you walk me through the evidence supporting that characterization?" Denise's attorney stood, referenced the fence post, the parking lot incident from months earlier, a general assertion that Walter lived alone and had become increasingly isolated since his wife's passing, which he offered as though isolation itself were a symptom rather than a fact of widowhood, shared by roughly half the courtroom's likely caseload. Patricia stood when he finished. She didn't raise her voice. I'd come to understand, over the past month, that she never needed to. Your Honor, I'd like to enter 3 exhibits. She slid the folder across. The first is a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation, dated 3 weeks ago, conducted by Dr. Amara Bassi, finding Mr. Hensley's cognitive function entirely within normal range across every domain tested. The second is a certified driving assessment, dated 2 weeks ago, in which the evaluator, 22 years experience, scored Mr. Hensley's performance as, in her own written words, exemplary, with no deficits identified in any area of concern. The third is a durable power of attorney, executed by Mr. Hensley of his own volition, before either evaluation, naming his son as agent for both financial and medical decisions, which I'd note directly undercuts the petition's core claim that Mr. Hensley lacks the capacity to arrange for his own future care. The judge read through the documents slowly. These evaluations were conducted after the petition was filed. Before, Your Honor, Mr. Hensley sought them independently, on his own initiative, once he became aware his daughter was exploring guardianship. Patricia let that sit a moment, before continuing. Which raises a timeline I'd like the court to consider. Bank records show Miss Marsh inquired about joint account access and power of attorney at Mr. Hensley's home branch 3 weeks before the fence post incident cited in her own petition as the triggering event. Records from a mortgage broker's office show Mr. Marsh inquired, 6 weeks before that same incident, what would happen to a reverse mortgage application if the homeowner's competency became, in his words, a documented concern down the road. I watched Denise's attorney's expression shift almost imperceptibly, the look of a man realizing mid-hearing that he'd been handed a weaker case than he'd been told. The judge looked up from the documents, directly at Denise. Ms. Marsh, I'd like to hear from you directly, if you're willing. Denise stood slowly. For a long moment, she didn't say anything at all, just looked at the folder on the table between us, at evidence that had apparently arranged itself into a shape she hadn't anticipated it taking. Craig's business is in trouble, she said finally, quiet, none of the crisp certainty she'd had in my driveway back in September. Bad trouble. We're looking at a lawsuit we can't afford to lose, and even if we win it, the legal fees alone. She stopped, started again. I found out about the mortgage broker conversation because I asked Craig to look into it, not the other way around. I told myself if we could just access some of Dad's equity, temporarily, we could get through this without anyone getting hurt, and I'd figure out how to pay it back before he ever needed it for anything himself. And the fence post? The judge asked, not unkindly. The fence post was real. I wasn't lying about that part. Denise's voice cracked slightly. But I think I'd already decided, before that happened, that this was going to be the plan. The fence post just gave me a story I could tell people. A story I could tell myself, honestly, so I didn't have to think too hard about what I was actually doing. She looked at me for the first time since the hearing began. I kept telling myself it was for his own good. I think some part of me knew, the whole time, it wasn't. I just needed it to be true badly enough that I stopped checking. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment. Judge Whitfield closed the folder in front of her. Based on the evidence presented, I find no basis to support a finding of incapacity. Mr. Hensley has demonstrated through independent and credible professional evaluation full capacity to manage his own person and affairs. This petition is denied. She looked at Denise, not unkindly but without softening it either. Ms. Marsh, I understand financial desperation drives people toward decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. I'd encourage you to pursue legitimate avenues for the difficulty you and your husband are facing. But I want to be clear that a guardianship petition is not a financial planning tool, and the court takes a dim view of it being used as one. This matter is closed. We didn't go out for a celebratory lunch afterward, the way I imagine this kind of story is supposed to end. Nobody in that courtroom felt much like celebrating. Denise waited for me outside, alone, Craig having driven off ahead of her, and for a moment, we just stood on the courthouse steps the way we had months earlier in my driveway, except this time it was me holding something and her waiting to see what I'd do with it. I don't expect you to forgive this quickly, she said. I'm not even sure I've forgiven myself for it yet. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, I said. I'm also not going to pretend I don't understand what fear does to people, Denise. I buried your mother 3 years ago, and I know exactly what it feels like to make bad decisions out of being scared of losing something. I'm not interested in punishing you for the rest of your life over this. I am interested in you never doing it again. I won't. Then let's start there. I thought about the durable power of attorney sitting in Patricia's office, naming Peter, not Denise. And I thought about how that wasn't a punishment either. It was simply the truth of where trust currently stood, which she'd have the chance, over time, to rebuild if she wanted to. You and Craig are going to need real help, not the kind you tried to get by convincing a judge I couldn't run my own life. If you want, I'll sit down with the two of you and a financial counselor, and we'll look at what's actually salvageable here, legitimately, with everyone's name on the paperwork and everyone knowing exactly what's happening. That's the only kind of help I'm willing to give. She nodded, eyes wet, and for the first time since September, she looked less like a woman executing a plan and more like my daughter. It's been 8 months now. Craig's business made it through the lawsuit with a settlement smaller than either of us expected, helped along by a legitimate loan I co-signed after Patricia, and an actual financial advisor reviewed every number together, out in the open, nothing hidden in anyone's purse. Denise and I talk every week. It isn't back to what it was before Margaret died. I don't know that it ever fully will be, but it's honest now, in a way it maybe hadn't been in a long while even before any of this started. I still drive myself everywhere. Tuesday mornings, same diner, same two friends who sat in the back of a courtroom without being asked, because that's simply what men do for each other after enough years of showing up. My granddaughter asked me last month, in the particular blunt way 7-year-olds ask things, why Mom had tried to take my car away. I told her the truth, the simplest version of it I could manage, that sometimes grown-ups get so scared of one problem that they convince themselves solving it is worth breaking something else, and that the bravest thing a person can do is admit it once they realize they were wrong. I keep that spare key on my regular keyring now, next to the original, which Denise mailed back to me the week after the hearing, with a short note I still have folded in my wallet. These were always yours. I'm sorry it took a courtroom for me to remember that. I framed something too, the same way I understand a friend of mine once framed a letter that mattered more to him than anything else he owned. Mine isn't a letter. It's the driving evaluation. The one that called my performance exemplary after 22 years of a woman rarely using that word, hanging in my hallway where I see it on my way out the door every single morning. Not because I need reminding that I can still drive, but because I need reminding some days that the people who love you can still get it wrong, badly and sincerely at the same time, and that the truth is usually patient enough to wait for you to go looking for it. If someone in your life has ever had their independence taken from them under the banner of being protected, I hope this reminded you that love and control aren't always as easy to tell apart as the person doing the controlling would like to believe. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is trust them enough to ask, instead of deciding for them. And if this story stays with you, there are more like it waiting, about family, about dignity, and about the quiet kind of proof that doesn't need to raise its voice to finally be heard.